Hey, welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you again. Today, we're going to be talking about social justice in the church. We're going to be highlighting the thinking of John Rawls, and I wanted to give my intro a brief introduction before I welcome him on the show, just because he has a really unique relationship to me in this podcast. I'm a pastor in Boulder at the Well Church, and my guest today came to our church in college while he was at the University of Colorado, what we call CU. If you're from out of state, you typically call it UC. It's not UC, it's CU.
That's right.
He was going to school there and met Megan, his now wife, and I got to do their premarital counseling. Didn't get the privilege of doing the wedding. We weren't close enough then, but he was happy to use my free services for premarital counseling as a pastor, as a good college student would. But in ministry, you get a lot of wins and losses, just seeing a lot of people go, especially in a college town like Boulder. A lot of people just move away. And so it's always a delight when I get to stay connected to someone and really get to see somebody who's interested in ministry, pursue ministry. And that's what James has done. So James and Megan, James is a pastor at Redemption Church, Denver. James, do you have one or two kids now?
Two, boy and a girl.
That's great, man. That's great. Well, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's fun to go back a long ways with somebody.
No kidding. So what's interesting about you, I want to talk about your church first. Where do you guys currently meet? What kind of building is it?
Yeah, so we moved across town a couple of years ago, just at the beginning of 2020, into this wonderful little chapel that we found that also happened to be a mortuary, which is what this building functioned as since like the 1950s when it was built. We've got like our offices or old viewing rooms where you would come in and view the dead bodies. And then we've got like a prep room that looks like where they filmed the movie Saw.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it has like a body fridge in it. Which is, I like to say one of the perks of membership that we have is we have a no questions asked, you can use the body fridge policy if you're a Redemption Church member. So it's a perk.
It is a perk.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say if you're church planting or looking for a place for your church to meet, body fridge is on the nice to have list.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you were telling me you have oversized doors as well. Is that correct?
Okay. So it's the best building to move in and out of because all of the doors are huge to move caskets around the building. So literally all of the doors, it's like they're all designed to move big, giant caskets around. And actually where our kids meet is the old casket showroom where, you would get sold casket salesmen. Those guys are the real deal. They're
Dude,
closers.
For real. Because you used to do, or you grew up in a family that did car sales. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And when I first moved to Denver, I was in software sales and then went back into the car business doing car sales before coming on with the church.
That's great. That's what they always say about pastors is there's at least two industries you can find. Insurance, because if you can sell people on, Jesus coming down out of the sky later, then you can definitely sell them some fire insurance.
That's right.
And then used cars is also a great career post
That's
being a
right.
pastor.
I remember seeing a list. It was like the most trustworthy and the most trusted and least trusted professions. And it was like nurses were the most trusted, more trusted than doctors. And in the least trusted list, both pastors and car salesmen were in the bottom 5. And I was both,
Oh, you're the
which
worst.
is pretty cool. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Now, you went to seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary, is that right?
Yeah, I'm still finishing out my degree.
Okay, which degree are you going for there?
Master of Arts in Theology.
Master of Arts in Theology. Okay, cool. And is that all online?
It is. Global studies, man.
Dude.
It's I'm a professional podcast listener.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No
I
kidding.
can listen to a podcast and take notes. That's for sure.
That's great, man.
Yeah.
Well, and then is your church currently going through the process in the Presbyterian Church? What is that like?
Yeah, that's right. So we're aiming to join the PCA. And at this point, it looks like me finishing school and then going through their ordination process. There's a couple of different ways you can go in, where the church goes in and then I go in later, or I go in and the church comes in later. They kind of handle that at 2 tiers, but we're going to try and keep it nice and tight and all go in together.
That's great. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to have you on the show today because we recently had you out at our church to do what we call Theology on Tap, and we did it on the topic of social justice. We'd been preaching a series inspired by a sermon series that Brian Brown did at Trinity Church Denver on justice, and so we kind of riffed on that, used a lot of his notes and outlines, and in the midst of preaching on justice through the 4 chapters of the narrative of redemption, the gospel story, we wanted to have a special night where we talk about social justice. I've written on social justice in my blog, whether people find it helpful or not. It was just some of my thoughts. And I know it's a question a lot of people are thinking about. It really popped pretty strong in 2020. But I just thought your insights that you brought, particularly on the philosopher John Rawls, were really unique. And so I wanted to share that with my guest. And your background, your undergrad is in philosophy, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so you got your undergrad at CU in philosophy, and you didn't become a barista. So congrats.
No, man, I got the only other job you can get. I became a pastor.
That's great.
With undergrad in philosophy, man. I would apply to companies and I'd say, I noticed on your website that you don't have a philosopher on staff. I think we can remedy that.
Yes, you can.
And Enterprise Rent-A-Car said our management program is for other people.
Other people.
Yeah.
That's
student
funny,
athletes and stuff.
That's great. Well, what sparked your curiosity on John Rawls and social justice? Was there something that you were like, I'm going to study this guy? Was it somebody you studied in undergrad? What kind of gives you credibility there?
Well, John Rawls was he's not a very well-known philosopher outside of philosophy circles. Within philosophy circles, he's one of like the most referenced philosophers of the last 50 years. And that's because political philosophy had kind of dead-ended, and especially social contract theory was sort of a relic of the past that nobody was engaging with in any sort of real way. You would study it as like, this is what John Locke said, or this is what Rousseau said. They have their famous social contract theories. And then this guy comes along in the 70s with a social contract theory that seems really intuitive, really useful, and it has these perks about these perks for secular philosophy, which is that it has no metaphysical backing. So John Locke or Rousseau or Hobbes, they're more like total philosophers. So you could read them on ethics, on politics, on metaphysics, and all sorts of. They're giving you a complete theory. Rawls isn't like that. He's just giving you a social contract for a political framework of justice. And I think that made a lot of sense in the sort of philosophy world at the time. So anyway, going through my undergrad at CU, we would hit him in just about every class.
Okay.
So in philosophy of race, we're using John Rawls paradigms to discuss the ethics of racial disparities.
Okay.
Excuse me.
You're good.
In philosophy in the environment, we're doing the same sort of pattern, and Rawls becomes the basis for all those. In our political philosophy discussions, Rawls seemed to be the one that, if the school had an intention, I'd think it would be to map our intuitions mostly onto someone like Rawls, as like, hey, here's someone who's contemporary, relatively innovative, in a way that is intuitive, which is important. You could actually use this to make ethical decisions or create an ethical framework.
Okay, that's great. That's really helpful. Thanks for explaining kind of where you kind of got familiarized with the concepts. I guess I need 2 clarifications, not just for me, but for anybody who's listening, there were two concepts, and if you could briefly just kind of highlight a definition, maybe. One, you highlighted social contract, and two, you highlighted metaphysics,
Sure.
which are both kind of terms that I'd love to provide some definition before we keep tracking.
Yeah. So social contract. There's a question in political philosophy, which is, why should we listen to the government? Anarchy is kind of the starting point for any political philosophy discussion. And then the government justifies itself. And so how do we justify the government? Christians, we have ways of doing this, in which we'd say, it's an authority, and these authorities are ordained and delegated by God. So we can tell all sorts of stories about how they originated or how they came to be, but ultimately we can say that their authority is designated by God. In a secular framework, or when you're trying to tell that story without God, then one of the common ways to justify the government is to say, imagine that there was an earlier state in which competing peoples had come together to make certain agreements that would allow them to create civilization. And that prior agreement, or at least the idea of that prior agreement, is a social contract, where we had come together in some prior state to bear the costs of civilization in order to together gain the benefits of being able to have repercussions when we're murdered, being able to maintain wealth over time and throughout generations, protect property, things of that nature.
Okay, so that's social contract. That's really helpful. Thanks for unpacking that. And then what about metaphysics? When we're talking about metaphysics, what are we talking about there?
Yeah, so for a metaphysic, we're asking questions about we're asking questions that are transcendent.
Okay.
So why? So we'd ask, a metaphysical question would be something like this. An ethical question would be like the trolley problem.
Yeah.
Do I kill 6 people or let 3 people die?
Right.
And that was like 25% of my undergrad was flipping levers on trolleys. A metaphysical question about ethics would be, does ethics exist?
Oh.
Are ethics the same thing as like the law of gravity, where it's something that we can measure and discover and it seems to exist outside of ourselves? Or are ethics something that we create that are more like customs, which we use which do not adhere in the world, but sort of emerge from cultures in order for the culture to sustain itself?
Gotcha. Okay.
So that'd be more like a metaphysical question about ethics.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thanks for explaining those. So with John Rawls particularly, let's talk about his approach to these matters of social contract, ethics, and particularly in your undergrad. I mean, it was you were going in the early 2010s, which seemed like forever ago now, but you were getting exposed to a lot of ideas that we're just now seeing, on commercials and movies and all this kind of stuff. So talk to me about some of that, and then talk to me about John Rawls specifically on those things.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I mean, in the early 2010s, this stuff felt really fringe, and it kind of, to me, it just felt like a reinforcement of like, yeah, see you Boulder, man. This is wannabe Berkeley,
Right.
They're really pushing the limit on a lot of these ideas. And then here we are 10 years later, and it's really mainstream.
Yeah.
And I think it's, it's intuitive to think in the terms that someone like Rawls has put forward and the implications of those things. It's taken place in some strange ways that I don't think Rawls would have anticipated at all. But no less, it's become a sort of framework for the way that we view things now. And that's actually what I like about talking about Rawls. as opposed to talking about some other philosophers that are more that are present in our culture, especially like the deconstructionists, the Foucaults and Derrida. Those guys seem really. I think it's like if you live kind of in like a geeky pastor world, like we kind of live in, then it's like, man, those guys are the problem. It's the French,
Okay.
which is, of course, because they're French,
And we're Americans.
Exactly. So they're the problem. But I don't think that the way that those guys think is really intuitive for most people.
Okay.
What I like about Rawls is he just seems really plainly intuitive, and then can lead to it can describe a lot of the things that we see taking place in the world now.
Okay. That makes sense. So what did Rawls come up with then?
Okay, so Rawls is a social contract theory of justice, and his project, part of his project, is trying to demonstrate that justice and fairness are not interchangeable words, but that fairness is actually foundational to justice. Okay. So fairness is the foundational principle, and justice is a way of accomplishing fairness, which is the ultimate thing that we're aiming at.
Okay.
Some things to note about his philosophy is it's purely political, and it has no metaphysical basis. So he's not asking questions like, can we discover a true ethic in the world that accomplishes fairness? He's not thinking of this like you might think of math as. He's not asking questions like, is math a useful tool, or is it a discovery of something that's there? Are these ethics a useful tool, or are they a discovery of something that's there? He's not interested in that question.
Okay.
It's purely political in the sense that he's only looking to have real conversations about the mechanisms in society through which goods and services and resources are distributed.
Okay.
So he's very boots on the ground.
So when you talk about politics and saying he's political, you're talking about goods, services being, whether it's distributed, controlled. Does that get into like ideas related to means of production and that kind of thing as well, and power?
Yeah, it does. It does, but in a really general sense, not like in a
communist sense.
He's nowhere near as, what was that?
In a communist or Marxist sense?
Yeah, he's nowhere as prescriptive as like a Marx. There's nothing like that. You would use his theory to assess whether or not Marx's principles were effective.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, to put some more meat on that, the structures, his theory of justice, he'd say, are about societal structures, government, economic, and family structures. That's what he's interested in.
Okay.
Okay, so it being purely political means there's no transcendent backing. So he can't appeal to any sort of reality of morality. And likewise, it being purely political means this isn't about individual virtue. So, the philosophy that's gotten really exciting lately, which is pretty cool, is like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, as like the Stoics are having this resurgence. That's all virtue. How can you embody these principles personally that will improve your life or lead to a meaningful life or the good life? He's not interested in that either. He's interested in the systems and institutions that are a part of the distribution of resources and how those in society would be structured. So it's purely political in the sense that it's not transcendent. It's just immanent. And it's purely political in the sense that it's not individual. It's about the intermediary structures in society that sort of negotiate terms between individuals.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. I want to ask a question now, but I want to hear after that. I want to hear about the idea of the veil of ignorance, I think is what it's called, with Rawls. One of the questions, because you just used two words that I think are really interesting to explore, transcendence and immanence. And if Rawls is coming at it with an immanent framework, and Christianity offers both, And you can make arguments and assessments. It's an interesting way to frame it. So transcendent is like the vertical, immanent is the horizontal, or however you want to describe it. There's a subtle tendency in evangelicalism, and at least in my estimation, that there's a lot of Gnostic tendencies where we kind of have this approach to Christianity, which is very ethereal. The trope, which I don't know if it's accurate or whatever, but it's a common thing where it's like you're too heavenly minded for any earthly good. Where you have a lot of Christianity that's very obsessed with feelings and thoughts and ideation and kind of a transcendent experience that you have every Sunday with the living God, which as pastors, we're like, yes, we want you to have an experience with God every Sunday. Like, it's not a question of like if we want that, but because we're so heavy on that foot, and we kind of removed our foot from the immanent because we're either scared of being called fundamentalist or legalist or whatever we are afraid of, but we've lacked an emphasis on the immanent framework. I feel like that opens up the door for people, especially Christians, to be susceptible to purely immanent frameworks because they want something tangible. They want something that's very applicable, that's very intuitive, like you said. Because on Sundays they're getting a very transcendent, Sky Daddy boyfriend songs, and then for the rest of the week they really don't know how that plays out. And so whenever an immanent framework that's very palpable and very practical comes along, it's like, well, that'll solve that need for me. When Christianity has always had that tool, but we probably have just forgotten how to use it. Do you think that's a fair observation?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a fair observation. And I think I think part of the way that I think about that is we kind of, I think that Christianity in the United States often like works, it moves dialogically with what the culture is doing. And if the culture captured the immanent space because of our abdication, then it's like in response and to show our difference and to show our uniqueness, we've moved into a more ethereal, purely transcendent type of space.
Right.
And yeah, the hope of Christianity, like the meaning of Christianity is in that it's not in the transcendent or in the immanent. The shock is that it's those are the same thing. That's the exciting thing to communicate about Christianity. That it took hundreds of years just to get down to that idea of like, what if we just went all in on God and all in on man to describe this Christ character?
Right.
Yeah, it's always that's the wild thing about Christianity is it's always like 100% of both.
Yeah, I love it. Oh, yeah. Man. Well, let's talk about the social justice kind of implications of the veil of ignorance and how the social contract works with John Rawls. So explain that to me for a second.
Yeah, so John Rawls's theory kind of works off this thought experiment where you have the which he calls the original position.
Okay.
And in the original position, you would have a society. You could just take our society, the way that it's laid out, the way that it's functioning. And you would kind of beam out, 100 or 50 or 1,000, whatever, some amount of people out of our society and place them behind this veil of ignorance. You've got to run kind of a Twilight Zone experiment here.
Right.
And behind the veil of ignorance, they don't know the category of identity that they will adhere in once they are put back into the society. In their job behind the veil of, so for example, they won't know like I'll be a man or I'll be a woman. They won't know if they'll be black or if they'll be white. They won't know if they'll be rich or poor. They won't know if they'll be smart or stupid or, all the different types of things that we can be.
Yeah.
Gay or straight. So behind this veil of ignorance, their job together is to come up with principles for how society should be structured, not knowing any of those defining characteristics about themselves. And the idea is that they would create the most fair society. And this thought experiment is meant to cause us to arrive at these two premises that Rawls thinks somebody behind the veil of ignorance, a group of people behind the veil of ignorance would arrive at together. So these two principles are that each person has an equal right to the most extensive liberty compatible with a like liberty for all.
Okay.
So we would all be, the thought is we would all be trying to maximize our own liberty, but in such a way where we wouldn't be compromising, whereas we would be compromising the liberty of others as little as possible. The reason being, we don't know what we're going to be when we arrive on the other side of the veil of ignorance. So our reasoning behind there is self-interested. And secondly, we would assume that inequalities are arbitrary unless it is reasonable to expect that they will work out for everyone's advantage.
Okay, explain that one.
Yeah, so the key thinking here is that behind this veil of ignorance, because we don't know whether we'll be rich, poor, smart, foolish, lazy, hardworking, and we're trying to create a society which would hedge all of our own interests within it. And it's a society of limited resources, right? That we're going to be going back into.
Right.
Then we would assume that all of the differences between us, all inequalities that we see, are arbitrary, unless those inequalities would work out for the betterment of the whole.
Okay.
So we could imagine that, there's some space in this thinking for the, we'd want to reward the hardworking in this society, so insofar as we all benefit from their hard work.
Okay.
So there's kind of a push-pull between the individual and the rest of society. But the baseline assumption is that all inequalities are fundamentally arbitrary.
Would the opposite of that thought then be, if all inequalities are arbitrary, is the opposite of arbitrary by design? So all inequalities are designed? Is that what you're suggesting, or what Rawls would suggest?
Rawls would, well, he's trying to show that we ought to think that all inequalities truly are arbitrary.
Okay.
But what you're hitting on is, well, okay, what are the other alternatives?
Right.
What are the other alternatives to inequalities being arbitrary?
Right.
And the ones that I think come to mind that we kind of use to explain that idea are, it's predestined by God. So he's allotted our borders and boundaries. There's you come into the world and you just receive it. Existence is part blessing, part problem.
It's derivative. Yeah.
The other is karma.
Okay.
Which is where you come into the world arriving in precisely the place that you deserve to be.
Gotcha.
And so there's a built-in justice. So we would say that there actually is no unfairness in the way that the world is distributed. There's actually perfect fairness.
Fascinating.
In the way that the world is distributed. And then lastly, which I think is, we have a very split mind in our culture, especially with regards to science. And the last one would be Darwinism, natural selection.
Yeah.
So that there's these, but you can see how that could almost fit into Rawls's framework, because the inequalities are over a long enough timeline for the betterment of us all. Now, you have trouble when you get words like betterment and stuff because you're smuggling in value judgments into a valueless system, but we do that all the time.
Yeah, right. All right, so the first one really makes sense. That's intuitive to at least Americans, I think, where it's like, liberty for all kind of concepts where, you don't want to infringe on other people. It's very much like a Gadsden flag, the don't step on me,
Yes.
don't tread on me idea, where it's like, and it has a libertarian kind of ethos to it. The second
Yeah, it
one
does.
plays out with, if there's an inequality, it's arbitrary. And so what type of society does this produce then?
So this is where I think it gets interesting. Is there are a couple of ideas that he smuggles in behind the veil of ignorance, which become really important when we're using this tool or this thought process to describe what justice is when we're out here in the real world.
Right.
Because what we're saying is, because the question becomes, okay, what are the meaningful categories of people where to which we would compare amongst each other to decide who is being treated fairly. So what he smuggles in is this idea that we have an intuitive sense or a clear understanding of what categories of people are.
Gotcha.
And what his theory then becomes susceptible to is the creation of new categories of people who can then compare themselves to other categories of people and make claims of injustice. So, for example, when he's writing this in the 70s, we don't have an identitarian concept of categories of people based on sexual preference in the same way that we do now.
Right.
Whereas now those are, we would treat that as a class of people. It's we see no genetic component. We see no, we don't even recognize, it's not a nature nurture conversation.
Right.
There's no conversation of essentiality in the person,
right,
which would designate this category.
Yes.
It's a activity or a predisposition that people like to participate in.
Okay.
And then reflexively make a claim of identity upon themselves.
Hmm.
But once that claim of identity is made, then they are able to show that all inequalities that they experience are fundamentally arbitrary.
Hmm.
And in that arbitrariness, we'd say, okay, we're in an unjust system. So I think gay marriage is a perfect example of this. And it shows how intuitive this became for Christians, especially those with a more libertarian bent. Because as Christians, we would say something like this. We'd say, gay people getting married doesn't take away any of my liberty. Therefore, I'm for the legalization of gay marriage. Heard so many Christians say that.
Right.
And we've also intuited just such a strong separation of church and state type of idea that we bake into that type of thing in the United States. So that sounds just like, I might have already said this, but that sounds just like each person has an equal right to the most extensive liberty compatible with a like liberty for all.
Right.
Gay people getting married doesn't take anything away from my marriage. It's compatible with a like liberty for all. And the interesting question is, does this category exist? And therefore, does the category of marriage count as an inequality?
Right.
Or is this actually just a mismatch of categories?
Okay.
Which might actually exist, so that marriage definitionally means man and a woman.
Right.
And therefore can't, without creating extreme contradictions, take place between a man and a man or a woman and a woman.
Right. It's interesting that the intersectionality discussion, which kind of happened in the 80s and 90s, seems to leech on to these understandings of justice, because the intersectionality approach is trying to create new identities of oppression and injustice in order to gain equal rights or like liberties for all, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a So that's why I think Rawls is really helpful, because you can kind of map where these ideas that seem so innocuous and so uh, intuitively true, like a like liberty for all that doesn't infringe, so long as it doesn't infringe upon mine. We want a system that gets rid of arbitrary inequalities unless those advance the common good. Those principles, like if you were to just meet me on the street and read me those, I'd say, great, good luck out there. I hope your project works. But the way that we've seen those play out has been just like a process of disintegration. And I'd say, like, here's what was missing by Rawls not recognizing that humans can't create our own categories for ourselves. That's the danger in this. Because what a system like this becomes, is it becomes an infinite regress of identity creation. And those identities are seeking to become more and more tyrannical over one another in order to, with claims of justice and fairness. And so the tool that's available to make more tyrannical claims over other people is identity creation.
Wow.
That's the flaw in his system.
Right.
Yeah. So that I think, I said this at our talk at Theology on Tap, which is, if you were to describe our culture, I think an infinite regress of identity creation that are seeking to be more and more tyrannical over one another is a pretty good description.
Yeah, and I mean, this is happening all over the place in terms of how people are trying to fabricate new identities. We could talk about the rise of transgenderism in teens. What's interesting to me to talk about is furries, the furry movement, and this was on A&M's campus back in the late 2000, like 2008, 2009. I saw people running around campus with tails, and ears. And so I think it's inevitable that that develops out of this new identity creation, because that's what it's become all about. If you can categorize yourself as a victim or some new like quirk, and apparently this is happening on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, but I see some people share what's going on, which looks like a dumpster fire, not just because it's run by China, but like you get a bunch of people that are like, these are my new pronouns, and the meme is like, new pronouns just dropped, and you get these people that are innovating new identities, and it's like, you've got to respect me or you're a wicked person.
Right.
Which maps very well with Rawls's theories, right?
And if you think about what identity is, it's almost inevitable, because an identity is identities are, in a sense, sets of rules that when we give something an identity, we're saying, here's the set of rules for this thing, and now I know how to interact with it.
Right.
At the most fundamental, like this chair that I'm sitting on, I name it a chair, and that gives me the rules to follow for how to interact with it.
Sure.
And you can bend those a bit. Like I could spin it around and sit like AC Slater.
Sure.
But I'm still operating within the rules of the chair.
Right.
And so identity, so here's what the problem becomes. Ultimately, in Rawls's idea, is he knows that in order for the rules to hold for all of society, they have to come from somewhere outside of the society itself.
Okay.
Because they need to be given in such a way where we all stand under them.
Okay.
Now, previous social contract theorists had placed that somewhere in history. The myth could do the work for us in that we were, like Rousseau, we were noble savages, or like Hobbes, we were just savages. We developed this contract somewhere back in history, but Rawls makes it present with just an intuition, but it's an intuition that takes us out of the immanent space, takes the person into behind the veil of ignorance, which I think is just a metaphor for transcendence.
Right.
But it's an odd transcendence because it's not a transcendence of all knowing. It's a transcendence of complete ignorance. And from this place of transcendence of complete ignorance, we are meant to create rules that adhere for all of humanity.
Sure.
Now, the reason that that's a flaw is because when we get back onto the other side, we're vulnerable. We're once again vulnerable to all the things that we didn't know. And so we can just say, you ought to have known when you were in the veil of ignorance. You ought to have known about this explosion of trans peoples, or you ought to have known that polyamory was just as useful or whatever, just as meaningful of a way to live as monogamy.
Sure.
Things like that. But what we need is, what we need is just an ordinary Christian doctrine, which is that there is a transcendent lawgiver who defines you and your categories, the categories that you ought to move in, and defines the world that you operate in, and then makes you correspond to one another with his rules. And in that place, in that correspondence, we see the interaction of transcendence and immanence.
Right.
And that is meaning. That's what a meaningful existence is.
Right.
It's where the transcendent and the immanent are interacting.
Right.
It's not in the. So here's what I think is the fundamental flaw of Rawls's argument is he's trying to manufacture transcendence. But ultimately it always collapses back into pure immanence.
Yeah, and out of that, it seems like you're suggesting pure tyranny because of the manufacture of new identities will inevitably involve power grabs and cries of oppression and victimization, where they have to exercise control and power over others.
Right.
And so without a transcendent... Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking, like, how does if you think of this as just like think of it as like the most base culture and the highest culture. We can think of the most base, which is the most immanent. Well, how does that culture hold itself together? It's just might makes right. It's just it's a primate society where the strongest silverback is the one who's in charge. And so it must operate on a tyrannical framework.
Gotcha. Okay.
The more immanent it is, then the more tyrannical it is.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it's just power.
Yeah.
It's just power.
And so I guess the hope that Christianity offers, because you touched on it, and I want to kind of close here, is that we have a transcendent lawgiver who has offered us to find our identity, if you want to use the word. American Reformer had an interesting article on finding our identity in Christ that made me rethink a lot of the language of identity. But a meaningful life is found in corresponding to the way God designed the world for your particular category and your particular station in life, and living in accordance with his ways, and ultimately finding hope and meaning in Christ, who satisfies those longings, but also reorients us to where we're not so introspective, where we're constantly searching and creating identities, where it's like we're trying on new costumes, but we're also not trying to tyrannize others, but we're trying to derive a source of correspondence to his reality so that we can live a meaningful life. But apart from Christ, that's going to be somewhat fruitless, very fruitless, ultimately. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Because in Christ, everything is there. Like all that we're looking to talk about, or the solution is there in Christ, because we need. This is another one of those like great things about Christianity is it just does everything all the time, all at once. And with Christ, it's like everything starts to collapse in on itself, and it's becomes almost too hard to talk about because there's so much there. But with just what you're saying, it's like we need a transcendent lawgiver who it is also making laws that are meaningful to persons. And those laws need to be meaningful. So they need to be immanent and transcendent. But they also need to be meaningful within a person, because that's the way that we experience the world, and among persons. Mm-hmm. So they need to be values and political. Mm-hmm. And they need to correspond to a world that really exists in a way that also corresponds to our minds that really exist, so that we can participate in them as whole persons. It's like we need a God man. We need a personal union that creates a body of people. This is the only ethical hope. Yeah, right. It's the only thing that answers all of those questions. And then you're being brought. I actually really like the word identity. I haven't read the American
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm not saying you can't use it. It's just an thought. I like it for it's been borrowed by a lot of the wrong people lately. Yeah. But I like it for Platonic reasons, like Plato reasons. Mm-hmm. Like there are identities which really exist, which then like adhere in the world. Yeah. And by participating in those true forms, we could say that you are then like participating in the reality of it. But then the crazy thing with Christ, and we can probably wrap up here, is we need that that perfect lawgiver who orients our life perfectly towards him, is also one who came to us in our flaws, in our inability to live up to that, and then participates in the whole structure. He participates in the curse of not adhering to that, and then brings that into his story as our forgiveness to participate in, and then reorients us back to him. So it's just this overwhelming fullness of what an ethic. The ethical implications are just unimaginable. Yeah, they're incredible. That's a great place to wrap up, because that's ultimately what we want to point people towards, and we want to steer people away from a Rawlsian concept of justice, not because it doesn't have some interesting ways it's impacting our culture and our lives today. I think we should be aware of it. But ultimately, Christianity and Christ offer something more satisfying, beautiful, real, honest, and transcendent and immanent, all the things we've been talking about. This is really interesting. I mean, we could keep talking about a lot of the implications for this, particularly around the topics of like predestination, and I know we can talk about economics and wealth, and that would be really fun, but maybe for another time. But James, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was really fun to talk about.
Is there a place that people can catch you? Obviously, they can go to your church website, hear your sermons, I'm assuming. Yeah,
that's right. Just go to redemptiondenver.com. That's where all my sermons are, and that's basically the only place I am.
Okay, cool. Well, I hope that more people can get exposed to your thinking. You're a really clear thinker, deep thinker, and I know you care about people, love people, and want them to love God more and love one another more. So thank you so much for helping my listeners toward that end. Thanks for being on the show, and we will hopefully have another James on the show next. We're going to have James Wood talking about his article on winsomeness, so you guys can look forward to that. But until then, we'll see you next time.